Okay, so like imagine this, right? It's like the middle of the night, you're sound asleep, and then bam, you're jolted awake, heart's probably racing, and all you hear is this deafening roar of jets, like right overhead.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
not just, any jets, but fighter jets, like the kind where the sonic booms just echo through the whole night.
I can't even imagine.
And here's the thing, it's not like you're on a battlefield or anything, you're in your own home, but it's like suddenly the war's found you anyway, and that's the reality for millions of people right now, caught in the middle of this whole Israel-Hezbollah conflict, and it just keeps escalating.
Yeah, it's just awful. And it feels like it's getting worse every day.
It really does. And that's what we're going to really dive into today, We're going beyond just the headlines. We're talking about the human cost of this conflict, those desperate calls for aid, and honestly, what is the rest of the world even doing about it?
Right. It often feels like it's just silence,
Yeah, it does. So we're using on-the-ground reports, what organizations like the UN are saying, what the experts are analyzing, trying to piece this whole thing together, not just what's happening, but why it matters to all of us.
Which is so important, right?
Yeah.
Like connecting those dots.
Exactly. So let's start with the most urgent thing right now, Gaza. The situation is beyond dire. The U.S. is even stepping in saying, Israel, you've got 30 days to get aid into Gaza, or we might have to cut off military aid.
Yeah, that was huge.
This isn't just a casual warning, right? This could be a total game changer, especially because of when this is all going down.
Right after the U.S. election.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, is this about helping the people in Gaza who are literally on the brink of famine? Or is this Biden trying to manage international pressure and U.S. politics at the same time?
It's such a good question. Because on the one hand, the U.S. has always had Israel's back, militarily and financially for a very long time. So to even suggest touching that aid money is dot bold.
It is.
But then on the other hand, things in Gaza are falling apart. The UN's using the word famine. People are running out of food, running out of options. How do you even begin to deal with that?
And it's almost strange, because you've got Israel saying, no, we're not blocking any aid. But then the UN calls it a Titan siege. It's what are we even supposed to believe?
It's a mess. And that kind of mixed messaging doesn't really help anyone.
It really doesn't. For instance, aid groups. They're saying they need at least 350 trucks of aid getting into Gaza every day to keep things from getting even worse.
350 trucks a day. That's a staggering amount.
It is, but the reality, Israel is only letting in 50 trucks. So clearly something isn't adding up here.
No, it's not. Is this Israel's way of trying to pressure Hamas? Or is it, like they're saying, just a logistical nightmare because of the war? Honestly, either way, it's the people who suffer.
Always. And it's not just Gaza. In Lebanon, it's estimated over 25% of the entire country is under evacuation orders right now.
Think about that. A quarter of a nation told to just leave their homes with whatever they can carry. It's just unthinkable.
It's heartbreaking. It's hard to even wrap your head around, right? A quarter of Lebanon displaced. And like we were saying, they need to go somewhere, find shelter, which puts a huge strain on the country, resources stretched thin, trying to support their own people in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. And that leads to another crisis, one that we don't always talk about as much because, the fighting is happening right now. But it's just as urgent, the potential for a huge health crisis.
Right. And it's not just about the obvious stuff, like injuries from the fighting, though that's awful enough.
Right. It's the conditions this conflict creates.
Yeah.
Perfect breeding ground for diseases, the kind that can spread like wildfire and have devastating effects.
The WHO, they're really concerned about cholera outbreaks, especially in places like Lebanon. You have all these people crammed together, not enough clean water, terrible sanitation.
It's a recipe for disaster. And sadly, we're already seeing it happen. Lebanon had its first case of cholera just recently.
And the WHO doesn't think it's the last one, right?
Definitely not. They're saying this could be just the beginning. And what's really frustrating is that cholera is preventable. It spreads through dirty water and food.
Which really highlights just how crucial basic sanitation is, especially in a war zone.
Exactly. But then you think, how do you even provide those things when a war is raging around you?
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult and sometimes dangerous for aid workers just to reach the people who need help.
It's a nightmare all around. And it's not just Lebanon we have to worry about. Gaza's healthcare system was already struggling after years of conflict, and the blockades haven't helped.
No, they haven't. Doctors Without Borders is saying they're completely overwhelmed. The need is just too great.
Not enough doctors, not enough supplies.
Exactly. And it's What can the international community really do to stop this from becoming even more catastrophic?
Right, because we hear the speeches, the calls for investigations, but what about concrete help? How do we fix what's happening right now? Andy address the long-term effects of all of this.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And let's circle back to the aid crisis in Gaza. The U.S. threatening to cut off military funding if Israel doesn't allow aid through, that's a big deal. But like we said before, the timing of it all, right after the U.S. elections, makes you wonder,
Of course. Is it really about pressuring Israel? Or is this more about Biden trying to look tough without having to actually do anything if Israel doesn't budge before the election?
It's like they're playing poker with people's lives.
Mm.
And in this game, the stakes couldn't be higher.
It's true. And don't forget, the U.S. gives a ton of military aid to Israel. So even the threat of losing that money could force Israel to make a move.
So everyone's watching, waiting to see what Israel will do. But this also brings us to a bigger issue, doesn't it? What about the root of all this conflict in the first place?
And that's where it gets really complicated. We've barely scratched the surface of this whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Decades of animosity, failed peace talks, settlements, the occupation.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is.
Yeah.
And every time it seems like there's a chance for peace, something happens, some kind of attack, and we're right back to square one.
It's like a never-ending cycle. And looking at the current political climate, it's hard to be optimistic.
I agree. Many people say that the current Israeli government is the most right-wing they've ever had. And they haven't exactly been supportive of a two-state solution. Plus, they keep expanding those settlements in the West Bank.
And then on the Palestinian side, you have a very divided leadership, which doesn't make negotiating any easier.
Not at all. And at the end of the day, it's the regular people stuck in the middle who suffer the most.
It always is. Which is why it's so important to remember the human cost of all this, the people whose lives have been shattered.
Because behind all the headlines and politics, there are real people just trying to make it through the day, to keep their families safe, to hold on to some kind of hope when everything feels impossible.
We have to remember that. It's easy to get caught up in all the details in history and politics, but this is about human beings.
It is. Parents in Gaza who can't even feed their children. Families in Lebanon crammed into whatever shelter they can find. And on both sides, kids who are growing up surrounded by violence and fear.
It's heartbreaking, and we can't forget about them.
We can't. It's our job as citizens of the world to pay attention, to talk about this, and to demand better from our leaders.
Because saying nothing, doing nothing, that's not an option. We can't ignore a humanitarian crisis like this.
Absolutely not.
But what can we actually do?
Well, step one is staying informed, which is exactly what we're doing here, digging deeper into this conflict, going beyond the surface.
Learning as much as we can.
Yes, but knowledge without action won't change anything. We have to help the organizations providing aid on the ground, talk to our elected officials, and call out misinformation whenever we see it.
Make our voices heard?
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
Yeah.
Every act of kindness, every time we try to bridge the gap between us, every time we demand better from our governments, it brings us closer to a better future, a more peaceful future.
Beautifully said. We've talked about a lot today, but there's one more thing about this conflict that doesn't get enough attention. Education.
And not just the fact that school's been interrupted, but what this means for an entire generation growing up in all this uncertainty.
Exactly. So let's shift gears and discuss that. So we've talked about what's happening right now, the displacement, the violence, this whole health crisis waiting to explode. But it's like, what about the things we don't see right away? The things that might not make the news, but will still be felt years from now.
Right, the long-term stuff, the hidden costs of war that everyone forgets about until it's too late.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest ones, especially with everything happening in Lebanon, is education. Like, I get it. When you've got all these families who've lost everything, you use whatever you can to help. Turning schools into shelters, it makes sense.
And the short term, yes.
Yeah.
But what happens when those schools can't open back up? What about all those kids who are missing out on an education?
It's a huge concern, right?
It is. Because education, it's not just about, memorizing facts. It's about opportunities, about breaking free from poverty, from violence, about building a better future. And when kids can't even go to school, it hurts everyone.
And we're not just talking about falling behind in their studies, though that's a problem too, right?
Of course. But it's more than that. Think about the social stuff, the emotional development that happens in schools, that sense of routine, having a safe and stable place, especially when everything else feels crazy. Kids need that.
Absolutely. For a lot of these kids, School is their safe place. It's where they can connect with other kids, talk about what they're going through, maybe even start to deal with all the trauma they've experienced.
Exactly. But when that's gone, when there's no school to go back to, it makes them even more vulnerable, more likely to end up in dangerous situations or get pulled into armed groups. And then the cycle of violence just continues.
It's like a trap.
Yeah.
But are there any bright spots? I mean, with everything going on, it's hard to imagine.
I know, but there are people out there doing amazing work, setting up classrooms in the shelters, getting learning materials to the kids, even training teachers to handle all the trauma these children are dealing with. It's incredible.
That's amazing.
It really is. Even in the darkest times, there are people who still believe in a better future. And for them, investing in these kids, in their education, that's how we get there.
I love that. So, shifting gears a bit, I want to touch on the settlements, because this conflict has really put a spotlight on that whole issue, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It's a sensitive topic, and it's been a major roadblock to peace for a long time.
And we saw how tense things are when the UK decided to put sanctions on those Israeli settlements. You know, the ones they say are making the violence worse.
It was a big statement from the UK, and it shows how worried the rest of the world is about those settlements growing and what that means for any hope of a two-state solution.
Because more settlements there are, the harder it becomes to even imagine Israelis and Palestinians living peacefully together.
Right. And we can't remember, these settlements aren't just some abstract political thing. They impact real people's lives every single day. We're talking about Palestinians losing their land, being blocked from moving freely, and having limited access to things like water and electricity. It's just adding fuel to the fire.
It's such a complicated situation. You've got this immediate Israel-Hezbollah conflict, then the humanitarian disasters in Gaza and Lebanon, and in this larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been simmering for decades. It feels impossible to untangle.
It is incredibly complex, and honestly, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all. Like, what can one person even do?
But that's the thing. We can't just throw our hands up and say it's too much. We can't turn away from the suffering.
We can't. And we can't forget that this conflict, it impacts everyone, even if we don't see it right away.
It destabilizes the entire region. It creates global tension, and it undermines everything we're trying to build in terms of international cooperation and basic human rights.
Exactly. So we have to find a way to make peace work. Violence can't be the answer.
It can't. So where do we go from here?
We have to understand this conflict, the history, the different perspectives, and most importantly, the human cost. We can't look away from that.
We need to talk about it, learn about it, and make sure we're not spreading misinformation. And we have to support the people and organizations working to build peace.
Yes. Even the smallest act of kindness can make a difference. When we stand up for what's right, when we hold our leaders accountable, it matters.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about what's happening over there. It's about all of us, the world we want to live in, the future we want for our kids.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from all of this, it's this. Even though it feels dark right now, even though the problems seem huge, there's always hope. Hope for peace, hope for justice, hope that we can overcome anything. So that's it for our deep dive today. Thank you for joining us. Keep asking questions, stay informed, and let's all keep working towards a more peaceful world.